Hello, my name is Catherine Wessinger, and welcome to the first World Religions and Spirituality Project video interview. And I'm pleased to be here with Dr. James T. Richardson, who will discuss his scholarly research on the brainwashing thesis. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Dr. Richardson. James T. Richardson is Professor Emeritus of Sociology and Judicial Studies at the University of Nevada, Reno. He earned his PhD in sociology at Washington State University in 1968 and his JD at the Old College, Nevada School of Law in 1986. He taught at the University of Nevada, Reno from 1968 to 2016, where he was a faculty member in the sociology department and the social psychology doctoral program. Additionally, he directed the master's and doctoral judicial studies program for trial judges, as well as the justice management master's program for others who work in the justice system. Dr. Richardson's areas of specialization include the sociology of law, the sociology of religion, social psychology of law, social movements, and social and behavioral science evidence. He is currently engaged in comparative research on law and religion, including use of courts to exert social control over minority religions, treatment of Muslims in court, evidentiary issues in courts, jury studies, and new minority faiths around the world. Dr. Richardson is the co-author and editor of 16 books. His most recent book, co-edited with Eileen Barker, is Reactions to the Law by Minority Religions, published 2021 in the Routledge Informed series. Dr. Richardson has also published numerous articles in scholarly journals. Dr. Richardson, welcome. We're glad to have you here, and thank you for agreeing to this interview on the brainwashing thesis and your critique of the brainwashing thesis. This is a topic that I've wanted to learn more about, so thank you for being here.
You're very welcome. I'm happy to be here. Hope it goes well.
All right, I'm sure it will. Great. So first, I want to ask you some questions about the concept of brainwashing and its origins. So who came up with the term brainwashing, and what is the origin of what we call the brainwashing thesis?
Well, it's a very fascinating beginning. It's interesting to realize that a word first appearing in print in 1951 is now part of everyday conversation and used in a lot of different ways. Edward Hunter wrote a book called Brainwashing in China. He was being paid by the CIA, by the way, to do this. It was a propaganda piece about how, supposedly to convince us about how bad the communist takeover in China was. So he wrote this book using the term for the first time ever. And then there were other people doing research that was somewhat related, particularly a social psychologist named Edgar Sheen did a book called Coercive Persuasion. I'll come back and talk about the details of that. Robert J. Lifton also wrote a book called Thought Reform. Those two publications came out, I think, in 1961. They focused on what had happened in China and also particularly what had happened after the Korean War, when nearly 24 American soldiers who were prisoners in North Korea refused to come home. It astonished many people and upset them, and somebody had to come up with an explanation of how that could occur. And so the simple reason, borrowing on Edward Hunter's discussion, was that these particular prisoners must have been brainwashed by the Chinese communists who were in charge of the prison camps in North Korea at the time. And that encouraged them or led them to decide to not come home to America when the war finally ended. At least it's not officially ended yet, but the hostilities had ceased and prisoners were exchanged. So that was the early beginning. And then in 1976, I think it was, the trial of the century, it was called at the time, Patty Hearst's trial. You may recall that she was kidnapped by a group, the Symbionese Liberation Front, they call themselves, and was kept in very harsh conditions, and later even was involved herself in some bank robberies, including a robbery where someone was shot and killed. When she was finally apprehended and put on trial, uh, she attempted to use a brainwashing defense that was unsuccessful at the time. Some prominent figures in the brainwashing debate were involved in that case, but she was convicted and sent to prison for 7 years. And it's worth noting, however, that her sentence was commuted 2 years later by President Carter, and she was fully pardoned by President Clinton. So maybe the defense worked in a certain sense. But the long and the short of it is, with the Patty Hearst trial, which everybody in America was aware of at the time, made the term brainwashing an everyday term. And it was then one of the psychiatrists who participated in that trial, Joel Fort is his name, F-O-R-T, has written since that it was a stroke of genius that those who were opposing the rise of new religions along about this time decided to use that concept to explain why so many of America's brightest and best young people had chosen to leave their usual place in society. Many of them on their way to law school or medical school or whatever, and join groups like the Hare Krishna, the Unification Church, the Jesus Movement groups, and totally drop out of what their parents thought they ought to be doing. Everybody began seeking an explanation of how that could be, and refusing to accept the idea that they might have exercised their volition and decided to reject American culture and some of its values and institutional structures and expectations and go try out a new lifestyle. Instead, the account that came to be widely diffused in the mass media and by parents and others who were opposed to the rise of new religions, they adopted this brainwashing notion that somehow the Chinese communists had developed a technique that we couldn't develop ourselves, but they developed some kind of magical technique that would convince otherwise reasonably well-educated, relatively affluent young people in America, thousands of them, to go join new religions. That magical kind of thinking turned out to serve a very useful purpose. It was an account that was developed to serve some purposes. There's a whole sociological literature about accounts that talks about the purpose served by these accounts. And this particular brainwashing account was extremely useful. It let parents off the hook. They instead of having to admit that they must have done something wrong and their kid didn't want his usual place in society, and then was fundraising for the Unification Church somewhere, it was handy to think about something had happened to them. An external agent had somehow brainwashed them into following this path. So that's a short version of a lengthy history. We can expand on it a little bit more in various directions if you want.
Okay. Well, you mentioned psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton and another researcher named Skeen. And so
Yeah.
Sheen or Shine, Anyway, however his name is pronounced. But how do they understand the concept of brainwashing, and how is that different from the concept of brainwashing that was popularized in relation to new religious movements, and specifically who popularized the concept of brainwashing as it was applied to new religious movements?
Well, the most well-known popularizer, who's now deceased, was a woman, a psychologist, clinical psychologist named Margaret Singer. She had worked as a graduate student with Edgar Schein and used that position to claim some expertise in the area of so-called brainwashing. She got interested in, and I'm not exactly sure why, whether people came to her for help or she just saw an opportunity to render her expertise in a slightly different way, but she became involved in a number of cases of people, parents wanting their child to leave one of these new movements. And so she started writing about the idea of a second level of brainwashing where no physical coercion was involved. Obviously, in the Chinese communist situation and in Korean prisoner of war camps, you're talking about very severe physical coercion. So somehow Margaret Singer and others who chose to sign on with her to promote this as an explanation of why people were joining new religious movements, had to figure out an adaptation. The idea had to evolve in some way. So they came up with the notion of a second order brainwashing that did not use physical coercion, but used everyday kinds of techniques, group pressures, and various things that had the same effect. Or Margaret Singer even testified. She testified in over 40 cases I'm aware of to this effect, that second order brainwashing was even more effective than the kind that used physical coercion. So that was her claim, which some of us were very disturbed to hear presented in courts of law. And as I think you're aware, a few scholars who had been studying new religious movements of various kinds were quite offended that this idea was being promoted in courts of law, and judges and juries were accepting it. And so we got involved in trying to help courts understand what was really happening, and there was no magical black box involved. It was young people exercising their volition, even if their parents and others didn't like the decisions they were making. They were exercising their volition, their human agency, to go try out a different lifestyle, a different ethic. Remember, this was a tumultuous time in American society. We're talking about the war in Vietnam. We're talking about racism and many cities in America experiencing riots, race-oriented riots of various kinds. Feminism was developing, and a lot of women were very disturbed at the expectation that they would simply get married and start raising kids and forget about everything. And so a lot of women were choosing to join new religious movements, not out of coercion, but because they didn't like the idea of this notion that they were on some kind of track that would have them married right after high school or into college and starting producing children, and that they wouldn't have any kind of meaningful role in the workplace, and no idea of a career or something of that nature. So a number of women got involved in these groups, and some of them developed into leadership positions. You've done more research on this aspect than I have. I should be interviewing you, but I just use that as an example that there were a lot of women, along with men, women were in a minority. There were more young men joining new religious movements than young women. But my point, based on a lot of research I did and a lot done by other scholars, was that these people weren't being tricked or coerced. They were just choosing to go do something else for a while and try out a different lifestyle, a different set of values. They did it rather temporarily, by the way. One of the points that I would really stress, and I could tell some interesting stories if we had time on this regard, but these new religious movements were typically very small and they had high attrition rates. What they were pass-through kind of organizations that a lot of young people were going to join temporarily as an alternative to being drafted or going to law school or med school or even college. They joined them for a while, but as a lot of research that I've done and people like Eileen Barker have done on the Moonies Unification Church particularly, and many other groups, the attrition rates were very high and these groups were actually quite small. I'll tell one quick story. One of my classes of judges that I was teaching one time wanted me to talk about this topic because they had heard that they'd learned I'd done research on them. And so I said, okay, I'll talk about it, but beforehand, I want you all to write down on a piece of paper how large you think the Unification Church is in America. So they all did that. They turned in numbers from 600,000 to 1.5 million. And I read those off to them and I said, would you be surprised to know that the Unification Church has never been larger than 10,000 members in America? They were stunned. They were absolutely floored. And so we spent a good hour after that trying to understand why they thought the number was so big and that there was a unificationist hiding under every bed of every teenager in America, ready to trap them into joining the Unification Church. So that's an illustration of what those of us doing real research on new religious movements, were facing, that kind of mentality that there must be one on every street corner. You can't send your teenager to the convenience store to get a loaf of bread because they might not make it home. That's the kind of mentality we were facing in the 70s and 80s, which led to this whole thing of people paying large sums of money to have their kid kidnapped and deprogrammed and all that sort of thing. But that's another topic, of course.
So Margaret Singer's brainwashing theory was rejected by the American Psychological Association. So why was it rejected and how did that come about?
Well, Margaret Singer was very well-known, active in the American Psychological Association. You need to understand that the American Psychological Association is made up of many subgroups of psychologists. I've been a member of Division 36, which is Psychologists of Religion, and have done research with other psychologists of religion in that area. There are other areas of psychology. Clinical psychology is a very large one, a large membership. And Margaret Singer was involved in a lot of these so-called cult brainwashing cases and had some people who were supportive of that notion. Basically, they were claiming that if you were brainwashed into a new religious movement, this was a mental health problem. And if it's a mental health problem, guess what? It requires intervention from mental health specialists. And so Margaret Singer had been very successful in getting brainwashing and even the notion of the problem of so-called cults included in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It was a real coup to do that, by the way. And when she would testify, she would sometimes come to the stand with a copy of the Diagnostic and Statistical Model clutched to her breast as she testified, because she wanted everybody to know that she had managed to get some of these entries into the thing. And so she defined herself as a real expert on this and was able to get away with it, if you will pardon the expression, for a bit of time, until others of us noticed what was going on and got very disturbed about it. And I was happy in 1988 with a graduate student, Brock Kilborn, to publish an article in the major journal of the American Psychological Association, the APA journal, and the American Psychologist is what it's called, where we debunked all of these theories. And I found out later it upset Margaret Singer and some of her followers a great deal, but they couldn't get a rebuttal published in that journal because it couldn't pass scientific review. She was making claims that were not defensible. She then talked the APA into establishing a separate commission that she headed to try to study this and come up with a position paper that the APA would adopt as a formal position on the matter. She developed a report which was reviewed by independent researchers and totally rejected, flatly rejected. And in fact, the APA sent a strongly worded letter to her and others that she had put on this commission, saying that they did not want them to claim in any public forum membership on this commission as some kind of sign of credibility, because the work of the commission has been totally rejected. Margaret Singer also ended up being disallowed from testifying in some cases. I was involved in some of those, and others, Newton Maloney, a very prominent psychologist of religion at the time, myself, a psychologist named Dick Anthony, got involved in some of these cases, writing amicus briefs and offering rebuttal testimony and serving as consultants. And she was finally stopped from testifying in a series of court cases at the federal level. And the federal criminal case, the Fishman case in 1990, and a civil case in 1991 in the federal court system. And that had an impact later in leading to that kind of testimony being disallowed in state courts, which are somewhat independent of the federal court system, but they pay attention to what's going on in the federal court system. So we finally got that kind of testimony stopped, mainly in court, where the term brainwashing would not be used. It's worth noting that some creative people in that area who were supporting the notion that members of new religious movements needed intervention from psychologists or psychiatrists, they've come up with some other terms like coercive persuasion. They now like to talk about that if they can. But mainly those kinds of cases are now being looked at with much more care by the judicial system. Some judges and some attorneys have gotten educated on problems with this kind of testimony. So it's hard to do it. It's not as easy to do it anymore in this country as it used to be.
We've already talked about some of the shortcomings of the brainwashing thesis, but people who want to argue for the brainwashing thesis or coercive persuasion, what sorts of empirical evidence do they present to support these claims? Why does it seem plausible to them and to a lot of other people?
Well, it's an account that serves their interests. Mm-hmm. There's a sociological area of study called accounts that's very important here. An account is something that you develop. It serves some kind of purpose. if you're going, if I was dating someone back in the days when I dated long ago, and she decided she'd had enough of me and dumped me, and my friends asked me about that, I develop an account, and I'd say it was a mutual understanding, or I dumped her. That's an account that serves my interest. The brainwashing account does the same thing. It lets parents off the hook. It lets the person who joined Unification Church and may have a year of vacancy on their resume. What did you do? What's the missing year? Well, I hate to talk about it, but I was brainwashed by the Unification Church or the Hare Krishna. So it became an account that served a lot of purposes for people to kind of get them off the hook and absolve them of responsibility. The kind of evidence that's cited for it by people who want to promote it is what we call anecdotal evidence. And quite often it involves an account of someone, for instance, who decided for whatever reason, maybe they were brainwashed, maybe they were deprogrammed and convinced they should leave one of these movements, or maybe they left themselves after spending a few months or a year or so in one of these groups. They've still got to explain that 2-year vacant spot in their resume. So they come up with these ideas and then they promote them. And they become kind of an anecdotal piece of evidence that someone says, well, I was at a low point. My girlfriend had just dumped me, or I'd flunked out of law school, and they took advantage of that, and I fell for it. I regret doing it now, but this kind of anecdotal evidence is very common in these so-called scientific papers published in journals like the Cultic Studies Review, that was designed, by the way, because they developed that journal in part because they couldn't get some of their material published in regular professionally refereed journals like the American Psychologist that I mentioned earlier. So they have their own journal that will publish things like this, but it's not typically peer-reviewed kind of evidence that you and I would think would be convincing evidence. It's anecdotal in nature. It involves case studies, and people can be convinced by that sort of thing. It doesn't convince someone like me, who's interviewed hundreds of people in America and in other countries who've been participants in these new religious movements. But it can be convincing to someone, to others, I assume.
The popular understanding of brainwashing is that it is a powerful process that is sufficient to undermine free will. So, how does the concept of free will provide a baseline for discussion of brainwashing?
Actually, the folks that promote this kind of notion are kind of turning free will on its head and ignoring the research that many people have done that end up demonstrating, based on interviews, participant observers studies, and other kinds of studies, that people are exercising their free will by choosing to participate in these groups. Our research has demonstrated that an agency-oriented approach is much more fruitful and helps understand what's going on. The good question to ask is, why did thousands and thousands of young people reject American culture and its values and its institutional structure and their own social location in that structure and choose to go try out a different lifestyle for at least a short period of time? That's an agency-oriented approach that emphasizes the free will of the people involved, the young people. It's very easy for adults with teenage children or college-age children to ignore the fact that their children have agency, that they can exercise their will, and that sometimes they do it in a way that makes decisions that their parents don't like, or decisions that even terrify their parents, because they've been convinced by watching mass media coverage. And by the way, brainwashing has pervaded mass media. It's a very common theme of programs that someone's been brainwashed and we've got to go rescue them. That's a good theme, and we've seen it in a number of different series on television and in movies and whatnot. There's some classic movies. Jane Campion, who won an Academy Award with the movie Piano way back when, her next movie was called Holy Smoke, and it's about a deprogramming that occurs in Australia. Mm-hmm. And if you'd ever like to see Harvey Keitel in a tutu,
I watched it.
It's an amazing movie, mm-hmm. and it demonstrates the kinds of things that are going on there. The movie actually upset the anti-cult movement, and pretty much because it made such fun of deprogramming in a way. And Harvey Keitel, the American deprogrammer, ends up being convinced by the person he's trying to deprogram to put on a tutu and do some ballerina dancing. Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful movie. Anyway, I almost forgot the topic, the question, but I hope I.
Yeah, sorry, I interrupted, but yeah, it was a pretty amazing movie. I had some students show it, and I was pretty appalled, actually, that the students thought on campus thought that this was something real. So anyway, sorry that I interrupted you.
No.
You were making a point about, young people in the 60s and the 70s converting, and their parents needing, grasping on to the brainwashing thesis to understand why they had chosen to join groups. But I also want to add that, this, new religious movements continue today, and people are still making choices to join new religious movements. And sometimes they make choices to join a movement that may be engaged in some kind of extreme behavior. And that happens all the time. But, for the example that I've studied intensively with, and that's the Branch Davidians outside Waco, Texas, those people, they made a choice to be there. They were very clear that it was their choice to be there, and that and a number of them made choices that they would leave. And
Yes.
and during the siege with the federal agents, they they made it clear to the negotiators that they were the ones who would decide when they left, and some of them did. Some of them did make the choice to come out.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to pursue that point a bit. There's a fascinating thing that's taking place now, because the brainwashing thesis has been adapted into the area of terrorism and joining terrorism groups. And that puts people who wanted to use it to explain away new religious movements in a real bind. If they're going to use it as a way to get everybody off the hook about joining new religious movements, what happens when someone who joins a terrorist group then tries to use it in their defense? Mm-hmm. The folks who were promoting it with reference to new religious movements, like the Branch Davidians, by the way, mm-hmm. are kind of stuck. If they accept it from, and this has actually happened, by the way, someone at least one American tried to use the brainwashing defense because he got arrested. An American was fighting on the wrong side in Iraq. He gets arrested. He said, well, I was brainwashed. Mm-hmm. Are they going to accept that explanation for him and let him off the hook? Mm-hmm. No, they didn't, by the way. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting, this term, now that Edward Hunter wrote it in 1951, it's just so fascinating. It's now being used in child custody battles in America and elsewhere. it's supposedly the underpinning of something called perennial alienation syndrome, where a mother brainwashes the child into not liking the father and using that in a custody battle. So, I mean, this term is now everywhere. It's just amazing to me to see how malleable it is and how useful it is for so many different. Anytime you don't like something that's happening, some kind of persuasive activity, we're very prone to call it brainwashing. And if you stay in some group, it's mind control, which is kind of the long-term brainwashing notion. If you stay in a group for more than a week or two, you're under mind control. So
Yeah.
sorry if I'm
No, that's
not.
great. So yeah, how did this concept of brainwashing or mind control, how did it become so pervasive and it's such an accepted idea in American culture here?
Well, it was because it served a lot of useful purposes. Uh, it turns out it's not so handy if you're trying to accuse someone in a terrorist organization, but there, if it's handy in custody battles, it's certainly been handy to people trying to explain why a son or daughter joined a new religious movement. It's handy if you buy a used car and it turns out to be a dud. He brainwashed me.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard it used in so many different ways, and it's so fascinating to think about the intellectual history of the term, that it first appeared in print in 1951, and now it's everywhere. It serves so many useful purposes for people, and they're prone to use it for whatever purpose.
I'm going to ask you about a specific case that I observed recently, and actually I've been watching a number of the documentaries on new religious movements, all types of new religious movements that have come out in recent years. And one example that I recently observed is in the third episode of the HBO documentary titled Heaven's Gate, The Cult of Cults. And former deprogrammer, now mental health counselor, Stephen Hassan, was consulted, and he stated that intelligent and educated persons can be drawn into cults because they are ignorant about what he terms cult technology. And then he went on to state that cult technology, or these techniques, include deception, manipulation, hypnosis, and behavior modification. He also stated that a person is likely to be recruited to join a cult when someone is experiencing a vulnerable moment in their life, typically due to a loss. What are your thoughts on Hassan's assertions?
I've actually, when I was on sabbatical in Australia, actually did a Australian public radio debate with him, which I won handily, of course. He's a former member of one of these groups, as you know, and he has developed an account of what happened to him, and he's turned it into a rather lucrative career, doing a lot of consulting and writing books and whatnot, which are very widely circulated around the world, by the way. I just completed a study of anti-cult legislation developed in Iran, and they're using one of his books and Margaret Singer's books as the underpinning for the legislation there, and totally ignoring all the counter research that's been done by people outside of Iran. His account focuses on kind of the worst possible examples of things that might happen to a person, and it totally ignores the agency of the people involved. The very group that he came out of was studied in depth by Eileen Barker, and in her research and research of other folks that have been published in reputable journals, demonstrates that of those who come into those groups, less than, I think it's in one particular study I saw, 0.0007%. In other words, less than 1,000th of a percent, people are still there 2 years later. If these techniques are so effective, why aren't these groups bigger? And why don't they last longer? I mean, a lot of new religions are faded away. They're all very small, really. Some of them are larger than others. I'll certainly admit that, and some of them had an international presence. I'd mentioned Scientology in that regard. But my biggest argument against the kinds of claims people like Hassan makes is that if these techniques are all being used, why aren't they effective? They're not effective. People come, and as I use the term pass-through organization, Jim Beckford, sociologist from the UK, has used that term in some of his work. They're pass-through organizations that people come into for a while, look around, and say, well, this is interesting. I'm glad I did it. I learned some things, but this is not for me for the rest of my life. So very few people who join these groups end up signing them for the long term and becoming, leaders and lasting for more than a short period of time. And all those things that Steve, Hassan, and others talk about as being the techniques that they use, I've been in these groups in the sense of doing participant observer research with them. And they just don't do things like this. They don't put people who come to hear a Bible study or something, they don't put them in a room for a week and totally isolate them. They may encourage them to avoid contact with their parents or friends for a while they try to teach them the doctrines or the practices of a group. But they know from experience that if they press too hard, guess what? The people walk out the door. They vote with their feet and they leave. And that's the attrition rates I've been stressing all along. If brainwashing was so effective, these groups, would be taking over the world now. They're not. Somebody else may be taking over the world, but it's not religious groups.
Okay. Let me just push you a little bit harder on this type of question. So how would you reply to people who allege that they were brainwashed because they were in a group in which they were subjected to overwork, sleep and food deprivation, and also perhaps strong peer pressure? And for instance, I think it was a trailer for the documentary on Nexium, the multi-part documentary on Nexium. And, oh no, I think there are two of those. Well, anyway, for one of those documentaries, a young woman who had gone through the process of being branded, which did happen within a subgroup within the Nexium group. I think someone said, well, didn't you choose to go through that? And she said, no way, because I was subjected to lack of sleep and lack of food, and I was working all the time.
There are extreme examples like that you just cited. I do have a response, and that is that people made a decision to join the group, and that had its consequences. I do reject the idea that they could never leave, because unless the door is barred and there are bars on the windows, then they could leave. They could exercise their volition just as they did to come into the group. Mm-hmm. They could leave, and many of them do. I mean, it's not like the police finally come and rescue folks, although, as I said, that's a common motif in television stories about this sort of thing and whatnot. But the fact is, most of these groups, in fact, all I've ever heard of, they don't lock the doors at night and force people to stay there. So it's regretful if someone decides to hang around for the kind of treatment you've described. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to believe it actually happened. It does happen in some rare cases, but the kinds of groups that have gotten the most notoriety, like the Unification Church, the Hare Krishna, the Children of God, those groups, they don't bar the doors.
Mm-hmm.
If people want to leave, they do. And that's mostly what happens. The groups end up being very small, with few people who've decided this is what I want to do for a longer period, or maybe even for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
It's regretful that it occurs, but I think they should exercise their volition, get out the same way they got in.
Yeah. I'll just mention, Jonestown, People's Temple in Jonestown is a case that I've studied. And of course, in Jonestown in Guyana, that was a case where they had locked the doors pretty much. But I would add that even in Jonestown, people were thinking critically, and a number of them wanted to get out. And they were either, a few got out, a few were trying to plan to get out, but the majority of the people were not able to get out because of the very isolated and extreme conditions there. But I think they were still thinking critically up until that last day when things just looked totally hopeless. And so then I think there's an element of strong peer pressure coming in. There was, during the death tape, the so-called death tape recording the final moments in Jonestown, a woman named Christine Miller stood up to argue with Jim Jones that the children deserve to live, the adults deserve to live, but someone else talked her down, and then other people were shouting her down. So
yeah.
So sometimes the group is going in a way that's not good, but people tend to go along with the group.
Oh, yes, I think that happens. It's also worth noting that when that final episode started, it was yet another example of the white knight ritual that they'd been practicing.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people showed up saying, oh, this is another false alarm. But it wasn't a false alarm this time. Jim Jones was deadly serious, and the potion was there, and they started drinking it. And then things like you just described did happen. But it was a ritual that they had been participating in, and who knew that it was the final one until they arrived there at the time. And you're right. The unusual thing about People's Temple was they were geographically isolated. Why that came to be is an interesting story in and of itself, as you well know. We have colleagues, friends who studied it, and I know some people who were there and whatnot. How they ended up making the decision to geographically isolate themselves is a case in point. And then frankly, what I would call a provocation, when they were visited by a congressman who didn't survive the visit, as we know. But there's some very unusual things about that particular episode in human behavior. And I would just make the point that while it's very fascinating and important to try to understand exactly what happened at People's Temple and why it ended up being such a mass tragedy, to then take that episode and generalize to thousands of new religious movements and claim, as anti-cultists claimed about some of the movements that I've studied, that this is going to lead, obviously, to mass suicide and murder in the future, like it did in Jonestown. That's an impossible claim to defend. but people have made that claim, as you know, and the Jonestown thing has kind of become the myth, the prototype to apply to a lot of new religious movements that are quite peaceful in their orientation and do not take the kinds of extreme behaviors that we saw at Jonestown.
Okay, thanks. So, how does the putative brainwashing process compare to what are regarded as more legitimate socialization practices employed by the military and boot camps and in monastic orders and so on?
Well, interestingly enough, if you were going to apply brainwashing with its implication of physical coercion to anything, it might be to some of these things you've talked about, like Marine boot camp or whatever, because there is physical coercion involved there. I look at this as kind of a sliding scale that at one end you can find situations where there's a great deal of physical coercion. And by the way, this you might be surprised to hear me say it, but I actually think in some ways it could be applied to what happened to Patty Hearst. She was locked in a closet. She was raped. And then later she was carrying an automatic rifle in a bank robbery. And yet the judge and the jury rejected the claim that she was brainwashed, but there was real physical coercion there. There's real physical coercion in Marine boot camp in Camp Pendleton in California. If you don't think there is, you ought to go look at some tapes or something about it. But at the other end of the scale, there are many activities we engage in on an everyday basis that are totally volitional. And those may be things we think we're exercising our will. Maybe we buy a used car because this person is especially skillful, and the later turns out to be a clunker, and we say we were brainwashed. But basically, we know when we buy a used car, we're not being brainwashed. That we're making a decision. We're subject to influence and pressure. And, there's a sliding scale about the kinds of situations you might get in as to how much pressure of various kinds, pressure from the group, pressure from a group leader. You may figure out a way that make a decision where you end up isolating yourself somewhat geographically. So, you can't just leave easily. It takes a lot of work to leave a group. But the idea of someone being coerced to join and do things, I take umbrage at that and think there's always a place in there that you can try to exercise volition and get away, unless you're under lock and key, and there's really no alternative. And those are very rare, and they're certainly rare with new religious movements. They're more up at the other end of the scale where a lot of volition is involved. And as I said, most people exercise their volition and decide after a short period of time, this is not for me. And they go on to something else. It might be another new religious movement, by the way. I developed a term early in some of my writings, conversion career, where people were moving from one movement to another. And then they eventually maybe get married and decide to start a family, or get tired of this and go back to school, or call up mom and dad and say, can I come home? And mom and dad, if they're smart, says yes. So there are lots of options there, but I continue to emphasize human agency and volition in all of these decisions, unless you're in a prison.
You mentioned Patty Hearst a couple of times, so I want to ask you sort of a side question here, because I think it was in relation to Patty Hearst's experiences that someone came up with the Stockholm theory or the Stockholm syndrome theory.
Right.
And that's where a captive starts to identify with their captor. Do you have
Yeah,
any opinions on that?
that comes from a bank robbery in Stockholm where some people were held hostage, but they came to uh, share the values of the people who were holding them hostage and later refused to testify against them in court. And so that got a lot of attention. How could that occur? And so it is tied in with the whole notion of brainwashing, that these people must have been brainwashed. But another more benign alternative is that they, during this time of intense socialization of a hostage situation, they talked to their captors and came to appreciate the values of what they were trying to accomplish through this bank robbery. They weren't just trying to get money and run away to some South Pacific island and retire for the rest of their lives. They had social values, social causes. So there is a more benign alternative explanation to the Stockholm syndrome. But again, it was so jarring to think that this would happen that a lot of people opted for a simplistic explanation of what had happened, and that these captors had somehow glommed onto this technique that had been developed in Russia with the show trials back in the 30s, or the Chinese communists in the 50s, or whatever. So it's an interesting side note to the brainwashing thing, and is quite often kind of wrapped around in the same kind of explanation as the brainwashing myth that was promoted so widely with new religious movements.
Okay, thanks. Well, you've already talked about the whole career or the brainwashing thesis in the courts. So thank you very much, and how judges in the U.S. courts decided to prevent testimony from so-called experts on brainwashing. But could you say something about testimony concerning alleged brainwashing in court cases in other countries? Do other countries allow brainwashing testimony, or testimony alleging brainwashing?
So much. In France, which has taken a very strong anti-cult position against new religious movements and some long-term religious organizations like the Jehovah's Witnesses, they've developed a term they call mental manipulation, which, if you look at how they define it, it looks a whole lot like what we're talking about today, that in the American context was referred to as brainwashing. It's also interesting to note that the French have made very strong efforts to promote their views about mental manipulation, or what happens when someone participates in a kind of a unacceptable sect or cult. Is the term cult is in the North American context, and sect is in the European context. But they have promoted their ideas elsewhere. They've attended and presented at conferences in China, of all places. They've gone to Poland. They've gone to Russia. They're very aggressive. They've been very aggressive in promoting their idea that this mental manipulation idea, that it can be used to take advantage of people in various ways. That kind of terminology is used in some legislative efforts in France and in some other countries where they've made efforts to influence what takes place. So it's alive and well in other areas of the world. It's ironic, by the way, that the term brainwashing has been adopted in China by some Chinese authorities to try to explain, again, why people join some religious groups like the Falun Gong or the Church of the Almighty God, are terrorist organizations, are terrorist groups that have been accused of terrorism, such as some Islamic groups that are quite controversial in China. And it's interesting that a term that was developed by someone writing underpay of the CIA in America first used the term, but now it's advantageous to Chinese authorities to use it to explain why folks are doing things that they don't think should happen.
Yeah, that's very ironic. Why do you think the media popularized the brainwashing thesis so much? I mean, it's frequently in fictional television shows and movies. Uh, why do you think it's so popular there?
They're trying to get viewers to watch things, and their viewers respond to that and kind of accept it. We've seen that with studies of potential jurors or actual jurors in some of these cases, that they're very prone to accept it, and the general public is prone to accept it. It's a common theme. There was a series maybe 20 years ago or 25 years ago starring a very famous actor, George Peppard, and the very first presentation of one of these programs that ran for several years was about rescuing someone from a religious group that was obviously, they didn't use the term Unification Church. Their lawyers told them they couldn't, but it was obviously rescuing someone who had in a group like the Unification Church, who was out raising money on the streets, peddling stuff and whatnot. So George Peppard, I think it was called A1. That's an odd title, but George Peppard was in it, and millions of Americans watched that first episode and got hooked on the series and whatnot. And the other thing is, news media organizations are managed, operated, run by representatives of a certain class in America, those to the highest status individuals. And some of them were able to very easily identify with fellow members of their class, their social status, their social location, who had, quote, lost sons or daughters to some of these groups. And so I think they were very prone to pick up on this and identify with it personally. I once was interviewed in Australia by someone who had been told by an editor to go do a big story on cults in Australia. And she found out I was visiting there on sabbatical and called me up for an interview. And we had a long discussion, hour or two long. And I gave her some other names of people to talk to, and she did. And she ended up writing a story about the anti-cult movement and how it was trying to deprogram and convince people, deprogram members and convince people that these new religions were something that needed to be somehow removed from Australian society. She handed in this story, and the editor read it and called her in and said, "We're not going to publish this story." Mm-hmm. And she said, "Why? I've worked a long time on this story." She said, and I quote, "Well, it's an interesting story, but this is not our take on this issue." That's a direct quote. Yeah. Because this woman was just stunned and called me up and told me what had happened when she met with the editor. "This is not our take on this issue," was what the editor said. So he obviously was sharing some values of those who were opposing any involvement of young people in Australian society in some of the new movements that had spread over there and developed indigenously there. So it was kind of an interesting example, I thought.
Yeah, it is. And I understand it. This continues. So there, when you're, I mean, I know you've given interviews to people in the media. I have. And when you give an interview, They don't always reveal to you what slant they're going to take, even if you ask. I've been taken in a couple of times.
So
All right. So, what are some possible outcomes of the public misconceptions about brainwashing?
um, I'm an optimist, I think, about this issue. Um, I'm I'm so happy that we did manage to educate the judiciary, or at least some members of the judiciary, about problems with this, and that it is no longer acceptable to say the term brainwashing in a court of law in America. I mean, there may be some places where that could still happen, a local court or something. Uh, but I'm delighted that that happened. I'm delighted that the American Psychological Association, even under huge pressure from the clinical psychologist area led by Margaret Singer and some others of her supporters, has formally rejected this kind of thinking. Um, but you know, it's. I did this study, which we published, of use of the terminology in other areas of the legal system, and found it cropping up in these custody cases. And that was very discouraging to me.
Mhm.
It's just not an adequate explanation of what might happen when there was a dispute in a custody case. But it was a handy thing for uh, fathers to make that kind of claim if a woman was saying that the child doesn't want to go with this father because he's abusive. And that's where it entered in. There's a whole huge literature on this whole area now, this so-called perennial alienation syndrome, and its underpinning is some brainwashing of children is going on. That's very discouraging to me. So I'm optimistic in one sense, but you know, I don't think we'll ever see the term not being used for things people don't like.
Yeah.
I think we're stuck with it.
My last question then is, how can how do you think new religion scholars can best respond to anti-cult scholars and documentaries that promote the concept of brainwashing?
It's a never-ending battle with some huge repercussions. I can personally testify. I've been sued twice for multi-million dollars. I'm happy to say I and those sued at by the same Margaret Singer sued me twice for debunking her work. And you know, when I came home and told my wife about this, she said, "If she wins, do we lose our house?" I mean, that's as a young scholar, that was a pretty serious question to
Hmm.
me,
Hmm.
and I had to try to deal with it. Um, I think we need to try to do a better job of educating people in the mass media about problems with the concept. And in that sense, I can only say that we have failed. It's not totally our fault, by the way. We have failed in educating people enough that some of these documentaries you're talking about got made without even contacting people like you or me or other scholars who've studied these kinds of issues, spent a lifetime doing it. We scholars need to be more aggressive in promoting our work and being willing to talk to the media. But frankly, there's another side to it. The media needs to understand that if they just talk to Steve Hassan, they're not getting the full story. If they just talk to Rick Ross, that's one side of the story. And frankly, they ought to be more enterprising and more willing to check and say, is there another perspective that I should take on this, that I should at least take into account? So, I've done a lot of work over the years talking to media, and sometimes they totally ignore it or take things out of context. And then there've been times that I've seen a documentary and I just shook my head because they didn't bother to even ask the question.
Have anything else you want to add in addition to that before we sign off?
I appreciate the opportunity and hope that if anybody bothers to watch this in the future, that they think it was useful. Thank you for inviting me to participate.
Well, thank you very much for participating and sharing the fruits of all your research and knowledge. So thank you very much.